Hey everybody, welcome back to Truth Revealed. I'm your host, Sergio Denaro, and today we are going to finish off Brian Higgins' testimony. So without any further ado, let's just dive right in here, and we're just going to go all the way to the end and finish his testimony today. To get caught up to where we left off at the end of the second episode, we left off with this question. But after you left the waterfall, at any point in time, did you speak to, text with, or communicate in any way, shape, or form, or see in any way, shape, or form either Mr. O'Keefe or Miss Reed? And he says, well, again, the only person I shot the text to while I was at the house was John. But after I left the waterfall, I never saw John O'Keefe or the defendant again. The pertinent part of that is that the word never is always problematic. I tried not to use the word always or the word never, but the word never literally is always problematic. So it's not always deceptive, but it's always a problem because there's almost always a better way to say what you're trying to say than by using never. When we looked at this, we saw that the word never here, he applied it to the defendant as well as John O'Keefe. To say that he never saw the defendant again is just objectively false. The only way that your mind can mistakenly process that is if you're thinking alive. Like, I never saw John O'Keefe again alive. But what you're probably thinking is, well, he was just thinking that night. But that's not part of the question. That is how people deceive you. You don't want to fall into that trap where people say something and then you try to change the words they say in order to interpret something that they didn't say, which is what they want you to believe. So if somebody doesn't say something to you, then it didn't happen. It's not their reality if they didn't say it. So he could have easily said, I didn't see John O'Keefe or the defendant again that night. That would have been the correct way to say that. But that's not what he said. He said, I never saw them again. And by saying that, it makes it much easier to deceive you. And the person speaking knows that you're going to, or they're counting on you saying, oh, I understand what they meant. But we don't do that because we've learned at this point that that is what deceptive people try to do. And so we focus only on what they say, not on what they're trying to insinuate and make you believe. All right, with that, we will continue moving forward here. And do you recall who amongst the group was still at the house at the time you left? He says, I think I was probably the first person to leave. Use of the word leave, again, that indicates conflict. When he says that he was the first person to leave, it's not possible that he was late to go anywhere because, well, for two reasons. Logically, it's not possible because that was the end of the night. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning and all he's going to do is go home. And he tells you when he's asked why he wants to go home. And he basically says, because they didn't have whiskey. So he doesn't give you any indication that his reality is telling you that he wanted to get out of there. He's not explaining any conflict. He's not telling you he had somewhere else to go. He's simply using the word leave inappropriately. And that to us indicates conflict. Let's see. He said everyone is having a good time, which again, that indicates that there is no conflict, which is an indicator of conflict. When you have the word leave and he says everyone's having a good time, that's conflict and deception by omission. He gives no explanation for the conflict. So the only possible explanation for left is that he was leaving the scene of a crime. That's a common phrase, to leave the scene of a crime. And your brain will associate that. The reason for that is because leaving indicates conflict and the scene of a crime is obviously an area of conflict. So he was leaving the scene of the crime. It's the only reason that his mind could have chosen that word. So a logical note here, deception detection does only that. The truth isn't always evident just because the lie is evident. We then need to utilize an intelligent process of elimination. So that's what we did here. We know that he can't be late to go anywhere at this point because it's the end of his day. And we also know that this conflict is not due to, let's say, an argument at the party because he says everyone's having a good time. If there was an argument and he was truthful, he would have stated that. They were talking about the election and they have different political leanings than I have. And so I was like, I don't want to be around for this. And he left. An honest person, if that was the reason why they left, would just tell you that. But he doesn't say that. He says everyone's having a good time. So we know, based on his statements, that he was in the midst of conflict that he's concealing. So now we have to go into this process of elimination. Why was he trying to conceal the conflict that was the reason why he was leaving? Could it be that there was somebody there that he was having an affair with, that was somebody else's wife, and he was uncomfortable? Well, not in this circumstance. I mean, that is a question that you should ask yourself. But in this circumstance, we already know that he's in a relationship with Karen Reed. And Karen Reed wasn't there. If he was disappointed that she didn't show up and he decided that he wasn't going to stay there, that still wouldn't indicate conflict. So he would say something along the lines of, I stayed for a little while, I socialized with everybody, but I got bored and decided to go home at about 1:00. That's the way that an honest person would say there's no bad feelings. They just weren't getting what they wanted out of the situation. And so we have the word left. So we have conflict, and we can eliminate that there was any conflict with anyone there because we have no indication of that, which means the only thing left logically is that the conflict was with John O'Keefe. All right. It's a little too much explanation. I'm going to go much faster for the rest of this. At any point in time, prior to this day, did you become aware or familiar with Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert? Okay, this is an interesting question because there's no reason for him to lie about this. Even if he's completely guilty and he actually is the one who solely by himself murdered John O'Keefe, there's no reason for him to lie about knowing Colin Albert. So he says, I know the name and I know that he is one of the sons of Chris Albert. Brian Higgins is very good at manipulation. He's not good at straight up lying, but he is good at coming up with phrases that the person asking the question is willing to accept and move on. But the first question that we want to ask ourselves always is, does this answer our question? At any point in time prior to this day, did you become aware or familiar with Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert? And he says, I know the name and I know that he is one of the sons of Chris Albert. That gives you no indication of whether or not he knows him. He could be best friends with him and he would still know his name and know that he's the son of Chris Albert. Or as he's implying, he may have never seen him before in his life, but he just knows the name. But he doesn't say that I've never seen him before in my life. All he says is, I know the name. And so this is not an answer to the question, which is definitive deception. Because when somebody evades the question, they've already told you that they heard the question, they understand the question, and now they're telling you they're not going to answer the question. When I say definitive, I mean everything that we're looking at has a statistical probability. Anything where the statistical probability is above about 95%, I'm going to say that's definitive because of a couple reasons. Number one, it's really high. But why am I comfortable using the word definitive? It's because we have about 1,000 indicators of deception in this statement, and you have to put them all together. So if you're turning this into a probability problem, what you're going to say is, what's the final probability of me pulling a red marble out of a container full of black marbles if I have a 95% chance of pulling a red marble and I pull 1,000 marbles with replacement? The chances of never pulling that red marble are going to be like one, I don't know what it is, 1 in a billion, something like that. It's going to be extremely, extremely low. So when I say I'm comfortable saying this is a definitive statement of deception, I'm saying that with this statement alone, that means the probability is very high, but it's also in combination with all of the other deception that we've already seen in the statement. It's definitive. This is a yes or no question. Thus, if it's not no, then it is yes. That is one of our fundamental principles in deception detection. So at any point, did you become familiar with Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert? The appropriate answer, if the answer was no, would be no. And he doesn't say that. And so that means yes, because that's an indicator of an awareness of guilt on his part. You familiar with what he looks like? He was actually a little surprised by this response from Brian Higgins. So he says, are you familiar with what he looks like? And then Brian Higgins says, if he walked in here right now, I wouldn't know. So that is, again, not an answer to the question. That is an evasive response. The question calls for a yes or no response. So you can either be the type of person who says, I am going to hear what you say, and I am going to go ahead and insinuate what you'd like me to believe and just live with blinders on, because that's essentially what they're asking you to do. But in deception detection, we are going to remove those blinders and say, okay, did he answer the question? And if he didn't, why didn't he answer the question? We already asked ourselves, did he answer the question? And the answer is no, he didn't. So now we have to ask ourselves, why? Why didn't he answer the question? It's a simple question. If Colin Albert were not involved in the incident, then Brian Higgins would have no issue with making that acquaintance public. It tells me definitively that Brian Higgins not only was a part of this murder, but Colin Albert was also a part of the murder. And Brian Higgins just told us that, because if Colin Albert were not involved in this, then Brian Higgins would have no problem saying either yes or no to the question. Again, I'm not saying that if Brian Higgins knows who Colin Albert is, then he's guilty. In fact, I would just move on if he would have said, yes, I know him, or I know what he looks like. But because he's evasive about it, now that tells me I have to ask the question, why? Why is he being evasive about this? And there's only one logical answer. That answer is that Colin Albert was involved, because Brian Higgins tells you that there's other people there. There's females that he didn't know. There was a guy who came in that was tall with dark hair. He gives a description of him, but he's not willing to give any information on Colin Albert. The only reason why people would do that is because that information is incriminating. So he doesn't want any more questions about Colin Albert. This is his way of saying, I'm not going to answer the question, but I also don't want any more questions about Colin Albert. All right, so here I put in an interesting graphic. Let's see the question first, and then we're going to go to this graphic. And as far as the accumulation that you had described before, as far as you could still see the blacktop and all that when you left the waterfall, what was it like when you came out of the house again? So he's talking about the snow accumulation. The question needs to be clear. And this question, it's not even crystal clear that he's talking about snow. He's talking about accumulations. So I don't like the questioning, but he says, again, I think that the streets that weren't being traveled, there was snow on them, there was coverage. Brian Higgins portrays so much deception around the level of snow that I was writing that off initially as, well, he's trying to say that there's snow because if John O'Keefe was dead on the lawn and he was covered in snow, then it would look like a mound of snow that somebody might not, in their peripheral vision, might not notice that. But because there's all this talk about sweeping the driveway, now in my mind, there's other reasons why the snow accumulation could be problematic. And why is he lying about the accumulation of snow? There's way too many indicators of deception here. In the last video, we saw a ton of indicators of deception. And now he says again, which is referring to a previous statement, which is usually problematic because it's easier to just respond to a question directly. To say again means that now I have to take the time to think about what I said before, all the information that I gathered to answer a question previously. The question is, as far as the accumulation that you described before, you could still see the blacktop when you left the waterfall. What was it like when you came out of the house again? This answer should be either there was a light dusting of snow, there was some accumulation, it was clear. An honest answer would be direct and it would answer the question. So because we have reference now to a previous answer that we know was deceptive, that makes this statement deceptive. Then after, again, we have I, which is a strong indicator of deception. 2 eyes is okay. That's an indicator of huge sensitivity. 3 eyes is an indicator of deception. I think, so now we have a reduction in commitment, that the streets that weren't being traveled, that's a negative statement. There was, so now we have a change in the verbiage and repeating of the verb there was snow on them, there was coverage. The question is, how much coverage was there? And we get 1, 2, 3, 4, we got 4 or 5 indicators of deception and then no answer to the question. So this caused me to go back and look this up because now I want to know what was the level of snow? And so we got this is Norwood, Maryland weather history. This is the weather station that is 1.5 miles away from 34 Fairview. It's the closest weather station to their house. And at 1:07 a.m., there was 0 precipitation at that point at 1:07. That's when the precipitation started. And so that's when they start recording. At 1:16 a.m., the precipitation in millimeters, not even inches here, this is millimeters, about 1/3 of a millimeter of precipitation. This is at the airport. So could it be a little bit more at the house? Sure. Could it have started snowing there a little bit sooner? Sure. But not much. We have to keep reality in mind here. You're not going to have 3 inches of snow at the Albert's house and 1.5 miles away at the weather station, you have 0 precipitation. The precipitation started at 1:07 and Brian Higgins stated that he left the house between 12:30 and 1. What this tells us is it's possible that there's a light dusting of snow at the house at 1 a.m. If the clouds were rolling, basically they hit their house first. And if they're moving, let's say they're creeping along at like 5 miles an hour. That means at 5 miles an hour, for them to go 1 mile, it's going to take like 12 minutes, something like that. It wouldn't be unreasonable to say that we could back this up 12 minutes. So at maybe 12:55, that there would be about 1/3 of a millimeter of snow. Now this puts a couple things into perspective for me. Number one, there's no possible way that he plowed the driveway at midnight when he got there, because it didn't even start snowing for an hour after that. I mean, we already have reason to believe that he plowed the driveway when he left, not when he got there. But now this is evidence. This is actual evidence that there was no snow at that point. So let's finish looking at this. Let's get some perspective. Between 1 a.m. and let's say 1:30. 1 a.m. to 1:30, we have about 0.6, so about half a millimeter worth of precipitation. And this is an accumulation. This is snow. Here we have 6 millimeters is the equivalent of 0.2 of a quarter of an inch. So at this point, you could have potentially a little over a millimeter. So there's very little snow. In fact, there's absolutely no reason that he would do a sweep of the driveway, even as he's leaving. He couldn't possibly, when he got there or when he left, have any reason to do that. It would not help them out at all. It even playing around, it wouldn't even be noticeable. There's absolutely no logical reason. Again, I'm inserting my logic into here, my reasoning for why I think certain things. I wrote in here in my notes as I was going through this the first time. I don't know why this didn't come into play in the trial. As far as the snow was concerned, and Higgins says yes. So now you have a jumping the gun answer. So we talked about the 2-second rule. If somebody asks you a question and it takes you a couple seconds to come up with an answer to a question that is something that everybody knows and is well aware of, then that's deception. But it works the other way too. If somebody starts to answer a question and the person and the subject responds too quickly, like they cut them off, it's because they're expecting that question, they've rehearsed the answer, and they don't want that question to go somewhere that they're not prepared for, so they cut them off and they start to answer too quickly. Too quickly is a indicator of deception. So as far as the snow is concerned, and he says yes. And then ADA Lally continues with the question, sticking to, or was it accumulating on the lawn as well? And now we have, I believe so. I mean, I walked. I mean, when I walked from the breezeway to the Jeep, there was snow on the ground. All right. Having all of this in perspective now, I think it's becoming very clear to everybody who's watching this that this is deceptive. There's so much wrong with the way he's describing the snow. Let's take a look at the deception here. We have, I believe, so I mean, I walked, I mean, when I walked. We have 6 I's. And then we have believe. So we have a reduction in commitment with 6 I's. When somebody says I 6 times, and these I's are connected because he's repeating. He says, I believe, I mean, I walked, I mean, when I walked. So because he's repeating the other words, he's repeating the I as well. And this all becomes one repetition. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 I's here. That means this is not just deceptive, but the truth is something that could end his life. That's the level of deception that we're talking about here. So he walked from the breezeway to the Jeep. There was snow on the ground. At this point, I don't think there was any snow on the ground. Not just because of the chart says that if he left at 1 o'clock, that there was no snow on the ground. It's possible that snow could have just started. Higgins is well aware of this. So we have this huge indicator of deception here. Now we have to ask ourselves, why is he being deceptive about this? Let's think about this logically and reasonably, and let's explore all possible answers, all possible reasons why he could be deceptive, because we know it's deceptive. He's saying that there's snow on the ground when there wasn't. Is that because he saw John O'Keefe's body on the lawn and just decided that he wasn't going to render aid? Like he saw him there, he figured he's probably dead. And then he decided, you know what, I'm going home. Forget him. So that would cause somebody to be deceptive there. Then they would be lying about how much snow was there. And they would say, I didn't see him because he was covered in snow. But we know that's not the case because there's numerous indicators here from Brian Higgins that he could see the lawn and he didn't see John O'Keefe laying in the lawn. He says that very directly. And it's one of the few things that he says honestly in this statement. So we know that Brian Higgins didn't see John O'Keefe on the lawn. So he's not saying that there's snow accumulation for that reason. And if he's not saying that, then there has to be another reason. If he's not being deceptive about seeing John O'Keefe laying on the lawn, then it has to be for doing the sweep with the plow. That's the only other thing that required snow. In his mind, he can't come out at this point and say, yeah, there was no snow when I left at 1 a.m. There was no snow on the ground, because that would call into question, why did you do the sweep of the driveway at midnight? Now, the front yard area of the house, is that something that you were looking at with any particularity or taking note of as you were walking to your Jeep down the driveway? He says, no, it was a long day. This is his rehearsed statement. And we've heard it was a long day probably 10 times in his statement. So that's well rehearsed. We had been on the road. This is passive voice. Passive voice usually means that they're concealing information. We have no commitment by the subject. We have an indicator of concealed information. And he didn't go home. We don't want to forget that. He says, I just was looking to get home as he was walking to his Jeep. At this point, his only focus was to get home. And that's a lie because he didn't go home. So the first use of we being after the murder is another definitive indicator that Higgins had an active role in John O'Keefe's death. So we've had numerous indicators so far, but this is another one. This is the first use of the word we by Brian Higgins, and it comes after the murder happens. So that is a huge, huge indicator. Now, I actually pulled another statement here. I want to show you. This we is in reference to Brian Albert. It indicates that now Higgins and Albert are BFFs. This question and answer. This is from the beginning, when in the first few minutes of his testimony, of Brian Higgins' testimony. Now, with respect to Brian Albert, how would you describe your relationship around this time in January 2020? This is a very pertinent question that really is something we want to pay close attention to as far as how he answers the question here. And remember, we looked at this question in depth because he says January 2022. So he says, he's a good friend. He's a coworker. I had been working closely with his unit. I tell you, he was a good friend. So remember, when we analyzed this before, this bumps up their level of friendship. He elevated his level of friendship here. So we had this strong elevation of the level of their friendship. But how do you know that that's deceptive? Because there's no use of the word we. And I know that when you're watching this, you're thinking, but we, it makes sense when you see it in there, or I can't see how they would phrase this differently. Well, this is a great example right here. He's a good friend. He's a coworker. I had been working closely with his unit. I tell you, he was a good friend. The deception in this statement lies in that it wasn't actual friendship. It was an elevation of Brian Albert's standing in Brian Higgins's mind. If it were actual friendship, he would have said, we were good friends. We were coworkers. I had been working closely with his unit. I tell you, we were good friends. That's the only honest way to say that. So the fact that there's no we here is a strong indicator that they are not actually friends, but that Brian Albert did something that elevated his standing in Brian Higgins's eyes. Now, all of a sudden, we have a we here. He says, no, it was a long day. We had been on the road. I just was looking to get home. Now, all of a sudden, we have a we. We have a closeness that we see in Brian Higgins that we haven't seen before. And it happens after the murder. All right. That's a lot of talk about we, but we is such an important word that it's worth the time that we spend on it, because I focus very heavily when I see that in statements, and I want you to know why it's so, so important. Okay. So the first use of the we being after the murder is another definitive indicator that Higgins had an active role in John O'Keefe's death.
And so when you get to your Jeep, can you describe to the jury sort of how it was that you pulled away, or what, if anything, you recall about that process?
So I got in the Jeep, started it up, may have looked at my phone, put it in drive and started to pull away. And then I'm like, put the plow up. So I reached, I moved a couple of feet. I heard it grinding on the ground, reached for the device called a fish stick, picked it up, lifted the plow, and then drove away.
And so when you get to your Jeep, how was it that you pulled away? And Higgins says, so I got in the Jeep, started up, may have looked at my phone, put it in drive, and started to pull away. And then I'm like, put the plow up. So I reached, I moved a couple of feet. I heard it grinding on the ground, reached for the device called a fish stick, picked it up, lifted the plow, and then drove away. All right. I'm really overemphasizing these indicators because I want to give you the chance to pick them up as I'm reading them. So we have an immediate indicator of sensitivity before we've even said anything here. That means the answer itself is sensitive. I got in the Jeep. So he uses the word I. He uses past tense. He uses active voice. I promise you, he does talk like a normal person when he's being honest. He did get in the Jeep. We know that this process was sensitive to him. And then he says, started up. So started is sometimes it's hard to know which color I should put this in because this is unnecessary information here, but it's also an indicator of missing time. So we have, which is an extra word put in here that to buy time to think of the response that he's going to give. And then you have started up. He doesn't say I started up, and it's extra information. There's no possible way that you could drive away from the house if you don't start your Jeep. So when somebody says that they did something that is common sense, like you can't have done the final outcome if you didn't do this. When somebody adds in that extra information, it makes this statement deceptive. And this extra information means that there's a reason why they're stating it. This information is very, very important in Brian Higgins' mind. If you tell me I brushed my teeth, I picked up my toothbrush, then I put toothpaste on it, then I put it under the water. All of this is information that anybody who's ever brushed their teeth before knows. So anyone who's ever driven away from a house before knows that you have to start your car. That's what I'm getting at. So we started up, which now is missing time. May have looked at my phone. Why? Why are you telling us this? What relevance does the fact that you don't even know if you looked at your phone? If he said, I definitively know that I looked at my phone and then I drove away, then I could say, okay, why were you looking at your phone? But he says, I may have looked at my phone. What this tells me is that, well, we have missing time. So we already definitively know that there's an action here that was cut out. Then may have looked at my phone is a buying time statement. It means that I was sitting in my car for a while and I didn't leave right away is what he's telling you. And he's trying to say, well, I did this and I did that and I did this and I did that. And the only question that we have as the interrogators here is, why are you trying to buy time here? Why didn't you pull away right away? Now is what I want to know. What action was this that took time for you? And he says, I put it in drive. Oh my God, like, get to the point, buddy. You started your car. I get it. You may have looked at your phone. Then you put it in drive. Okay. And then he said it started to pull away. Now this started is tied to something. So to pull away. And then I'm like, put the plow up. We know that as he started to pull away, there's missing time there. And that missing time, he refers to it twice. There's missing time. And whatever action he cut out now requires him to put the plow up. The only action that you can do that's going to require you to put the plow up is putting the plow down. And the reason why I'm hitting this so hard is because we had a lot of indicators that he didn't sweep the driveway when he first pulled up. And now we have this hugely sensitive response here that tells us that this is the time that he swept the driveway as he was leaving. So there's all this missing time, all this sensitivity, all this unimportant information. And I'm like, put the plow up. So we have an explanatory statement here. I reach, you know, I moved a couple of feet. I heard it. So we have all of this repetition here. So hugely sensitive. I heard it grinding on the ground. So what he's telling you is he swept the driveway and then he didn't lift the plow. And as that real smooth concrete in the driveway hits the street, it starts to grind because asphalt is rough. So there was a very distinct sound change from plowing the smooth driveway to hitting the rough street. At that point, he decided to pick up the plow. I heard it grinding on the ground. Then now there's no I here. He removes I from this. And so this becomes all completely deceptive. Reach for the device called a fish stick. That's almost like he's telling you to do that. Reach for the device called a fish stick. Picked it up. Again, missing I. So we have 2 missing I's here. Lifted the plow and then drove away. So 3 missing I's here. So we have unimportant information. We have missing I's. We have may have looked at my phone. That's unimportant information. Building an excuse for not pulling away immediately. Put it in D. More unimportant information. Started equals missing time. Put the plow up. That means the plow was down. This is out of sequence information. He doesn't tell you when he put the plow down. He leaves you to insinuate that it was from sweeping the driveway before, but it doesn't even make any sense. Why would you sweep the driveway even if it was an hour before and then drive all the way into your parking space with the plow down? That doesn't make any sense. If he's so sensitive to hearing that sound here after less than 1 foot, he wouldn't have done it before. And so we have logical problems with this statement as well. There's 3 missing I's, which indicates deception throughout the whole paragraph, and very specifically here. And then use of both explanatory and you know equals extreme sensitivity to this time. All right, so what does this tell us? It tells us he swept the driveway right here. Now we have to ask why. Can we actually figure out why he did it? There could be a couple of reasons why. So would he be trying to get rid of tire tracks? I don't see why he would be doing that. At this point, the snow literally just started. There's maybe a light dusting of snow on the ground. It may not even be sticking yet. And so getting rid of tire tracks, there's no way that there would be tire tracks at this point. So why else would he do that? If there's basically no snow on the ground, why would you sweep the driveway at all? I mean, at this point, we definitively know he didn't sweep the driveway at 12. There was no snow then. I hesitate to jump to the conclusion that there was evidence in the driveway that he was getting rid of, but I can't see any other logical explanation for this unless he's just in the process of losing his mind. Getting rid of evidence is the only reason that I can think of. If you can think of another reason why he would do that, please let me know in the comments why he would be sweeping the driveway when he's leaving, when there's barely any snow, if it's not to get rid of evidence. So I believe this is when Higgins did the sweep of the driveway. He is even compelled to say that he put the plow up at this time. I believe that Higgins removed a crucial piece of evidence here, possibly the murder weapon or something that would have tied himself to John O'Keefe's murder.